The Scramble for Africa was one of the largest mass killings in history. Nearly 20 million people were killed, a human toll greater than some of the most infamous tragedies of the modern era. Most deaths were due to war, massacres, forced labor, starvation, and disease under colonial rule. Across Africa, resistance is met with ruthless firepower. The British, French, Germans, Belgians, and Portuguese unleashed their military forces. The Maxim gun, a new and deadly weapon, cuts down warriors by the thousands. Entire cities are burned, leaders are executed, and the grip of colonial rule tightens. The British Empire stretches from the deserts of Egypt to the gold mines of South Africa. Their strategy is one of control, diplomacy where it suits them, military force where it does not. In 1879, the Zulu warriors faced the British at Isandlwana, armed only with spears and shields. Their courage is unmatched, but against the might of British rifles, thousands fall. In Sudan, the Mahdist resistance wages war, only to be crushed by British artillery. And in South Africa, the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, are locked in a brutal war that will see 75,000 people perish, many in British concentration camps. With each conquest, Britain expands its economic empire, turning African lands into plantations and mines that fuel its industries. Entire communities are uprooted and forced into labor, living and dying in conditions unfit for animals. By 1914, Britain controls over 30% of Africa, its wealth built on the backs of the colonized. France pursues empire not just with the gun, but with the mind. Their policy of assimilation seeks to erase African identities, replacing them with French culture, language, and law. But African resistance does not break so easily. In West Africa, Samurai Touré fights for nearly 2 decades, building an empire that defies French rule until his capture. In Algeria, over 800,000 people perish in the fight against colonial rule. And in Madagascar, entire communities are uprooted as France imposes its dominion. Through forced labor and economic exploitation, France's empire thrives, its cities in Europe growing richer, while African lives are spent like currency. Over 1.5 million Africans die under French colonial rule. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Women and children slaughtered to send a message, submit or be exterminated. No colony sees more horror than the Congo Free State, the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. Here, men, women, and children are forced to harvest rubber under threat of the whip. For every basket of rubber not filled, a hand is severed. Villages that fail to meet quotas are burned to the ground. Between 5 to 10 million people perish. Their deaths, a silent echo beneath the wealth that flows to Belgium. Infants were torn from their mothers, men beaten to death, and women raped by colonial officers for sport. Only when the world learns of these horrors does the Belgian government strip Leopold of his colony. But the suffering does not end. The scars left on the Congo will never fully heal. Germany arrives late to the race for Africa, but its rule is among the most violent. In German Southwest Africa, Namibia, the Herero and Nama people rise up against oppression. The German response is not war, it is extermination. Driven into the desert, men, women, and children are left to die of thirst. Concentration camps are filled with starving prisoners. Over 80% of the Herero people vanish from the earth. German soldiers were given explicit orders: kill every Herero, man, woman, and child. In Tanzania, the Maji Maji rebellion fights against German rule. In retaliation, German troops burn crops, poison wells, and slaughter entire villages, leaving over 250,000 dead. Portugal was one of the first European nations to step foot in Africa, but in the era of the Scramble, it struggles to hold its territories in Angola and Mozambique. Through brutal forced labor and economic exploitation, Portugal maintains control. Entire generations are enslaved, working plantations until they collapse from exhaustion. Unlike Britain and France, it refuses to leave even after World War II, clinging to its colonies until the revolutions of the 1970s. The Scramble for Africa was not just a conquest of land, it was a conquest of lives. Nearly 20 million souls perished, their sacrifices buried beneath the wealth of empires. The conquest of Africa was not only fought on the battlefield, it was fought with deception. European powers lied, manipulated, and betrayed African leaders, using false promises of alliances, protection, and trade to turn brother against brother. In Ghana, the British signed treaties with local kings under the pretense of partnership, only to later declare their territories part of the British Empire without consent. In Uganda, the British promised King Mwanga the second protection from rival factions, only to exile him once their power was secure. In Nigeria, the British signed the 1885 treaty with the Oba of Benin, promising peace. Yet, in 1897, they launched a brutal invasion, burning Benin City to the ground and looting its treasures. The French deceived West African rulers into believing they would maintain their autonomy, only to later strip them of power and enslave their people. These betrayals shattered African unity and paved the way for the full-scale occupation of the continent. The few rulers who resisted were demonized, hunted, and exterminated. The consequences of the scramble for Africa did not stay contained to the continent. The very competition for land and power that fueled European expansion into Africa also set the stage for World War I. The rivalries between Britain, France, and Germany, escalated by colonial ambitions, led directly to the tensions that exploded in 1914. Germany, a latecomer to empire building, wanted more colonial territory. Britain and France, already dominant, sought to block its expansion. The military buildup and arms race that had been used to dominate Africa was now turned against Europe itself. The African colonies were drawn into the war, forced to send millions of men as soldiers and laborers to fight and die in a conflict that was not theirs. Over 2 million Africans were conscripted, and more than 1.5 million died. The scars of World War I did not heal. Instead, they festered. Europe once again collapsed into global conflict in 1939. This time, the war would not only destroy cities, it would shatter empires. The same nations that once carved up Africa were now in ruins, their economies in collapse, their treasuries emptied. The colonial powers that had once ruled with an iron fist could no longer afford their global dominance, but they would not leave Africa without a plan. The empires may have fallen, but their influence had to remain. And so, Europe devised a new strategy, not through military force, but through economic chains, political puppets, and a system designed to keep Africa dependent even after so-called independence. By 1945, Europe was in ruins. London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels were devastated. The cost of war had been too great. Once mighty colonial empires could no longer fund their armies, no longer maintain their vast overseas territories. Britain was bankrupt, surviving only because of loans from the United States. France had lost control of its colonies during the Nazi occupation, exposing its military weakness. Belgium, which had profited immensely from the brutal exploitation of the Congo, was now economically crippled. Portugal and Spain, long-standing colonial powers, were too poor to resist the tide of decolonization. For the first time in centuries, Europe needed Africa more than Africa needed Europe. But rather than allow true independence, they chose a new form of control, economic exploitation, disguised as liberation. As African liberation movements grew stronger, Europe faced a dilemma. Direct colonial rule was no longer sustainable, but simply abandoning their African territories would mean losing access to the gold, diamonds, oil, rubber, and agricultural wealth that had fueled their economies for centuries. And so a plan was devised: gradual independence. Instead of fighting to hold on to their colonies, European powers began negotiating peaceful transfers of power. New African governments were established, but only under leaders handpicked by European powers. Economic policies were put in place that ensured that African resources would still flow into European economies, even after colonialism officially ended. This was not true independence, it was neo-colonialism. In the aftermath of World War II, Europe needed raw materials to rebuild its cities, factories, and economies. Where would they get them? From Africa. The British Commonwealth system ensured that former British colonies would keep trading primarily with Britain. France created the CFA franc, a currency that forced West African economies to remain under French control. Belgium ensured its corporations still controlled Congo's mineral wealth even after independence was granted. Africa became the economic engine that allowed Europe to recover, but Africans themselves saw little benefit. Railroads built in Africa were not for Africans. They were designed to export raw materials to Europe. Agricultural policies favored the production of cash crops, cotton, coffee, rubber, while African people faced food shortages. Foreign companies took control of African industries, ensuring that profits still flowed out of the continent. For Africa, independence was a political illusion. The real power remained in European hands. To maintain control, Europe left Africa divided, weakened, and easy to manipulate. Borders were drawn to create ethnic and political conflicts, ensuring African nations would be too divided to unite against European interests. Key nationalist leaders were assassinated or overthrown, often with European or American backing. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau, all removed because they sought true independence. Military coups were encouraged and funded, keeping corrupt, pro-Western leaders in power while the people suffered. Where colonial rulers once held the whip, now African leaders, handpicked by the West, did their bidding. Even today, Africa remains trapped in a system designed to benefit the former colonial powers. Many African nations were forced to take massive loans from the International Monetary Fund, which came with conditions that favored European and American interests. Western corporations still dominate Africa's oil, mining, and agriculture, ensuring that profits go overseas rather than into African communities. French troops remain stationed in West Africa, while the US and Europe continue to back leaders who serve their interests. This is not freedom. This is economic slavery. The scramble for Africa did not end with colonial rule. It simply changed form. Europe's empires collapsed, but their control remained. Africa did not destroy Europe. Europe destroyed itself. The greed, violence, and arrogance that fueled the scramble for Africa eventually led to their own downfall, but their system of control survived. The battle for independence was never about flags or national anthems. It was about true sovereignty, economic freedom, and African self-determination. And that battle is not over. The question remains, when will Africa finally break free?